Have you ever walked through an abandoned village? No voices, not even a dog's bark. The houses so run down, the ceilings caved in, and yet, you can't shake the feeling that something is watching you. In Hong Kong, there are many places that look like nothing on the surface, but behind every cracked wall, every rotting rooftop, there might be a piece of history no one ever told you. During the Japanese occupation, many of the rural villages in the outskirts were turned into temporary military outposts. Some villagers were dragged into their homes, beaten, interrogated, and in some cases, executed on the spot. People say whole villages were wiped out. No proper burials, no markers, the bodies left to rot in their own homes. Then bones, then dust. And from that dust came a wind full of resentment. You might say, that was so long ago. It's all in the past now, right? But some places, they don't let go. You think no one lives there, only because you can't see who still does. And this story happened in one of those villages. A group of boys, looking for thrills, stumbled into something they should have never touched. Without knowing it, they crossed a line. This story takes place in the 1960s, in the rural outskirts of Hong Kong. Back then, the countryside was very different from what it is now. There wasn't much development, not many people lived there, and most of them were indigenous villagers. Their ancestors had already settled in that area over 200 years ago. Because the area lacked proper infrastructure, transportation was inconvenient, and there were hardly any entertainment options. There were also many abandoned lands and empty houses scattered around. Kids growing up in that kind of environment usually didn't go into the city to play, because it took a long train ride to get there. So most of the time, they would just gather in groups and run around the nearby hills and forests, or play in old broken-down houses. They even came up with their own games like hide and seek. Many of those abandoned houses had ghost stories tied to them, but that only made them more attractive. The scarier the story, the more the kids wanted to explore. Young people always liked to challenge taboos. One day, 3 teenage boys were feeling bored and wanted to do something new. One of them suggested, "Why don't we go play inside the most haunted house in the village?" But going during the daytime didn't sound exciting enough. So they decided to go at night, and not just any night, but on the ghost festival of the lunar calendar in July, just to make it even more thrilling. They didn't just plan to go in and look around. They decided to bring firecrackers to set off inside the haunted house. In traditional Chinese beliefs, people are told not to go out at night during the ghost festival and not to swim or do risky things, because it's easier to run into spirits. But these 3 boys thought, the more forbidden, the more fun. That night, they brought a big bag full of firecrackers and went to the haunted house. But they didn't actually go inside. Instead, they lit the firecrackers outside and threw them in through the windows, like throwing grenades. They even picked up cow dung from the ground and threw that in too, just to make the place smell even worse when the firecrackers exploded. The whole house became loud and stinky. They laughed and had the time of their lives, and then went home to sleep, thinking it was just another night of fun. But the next morning, strange things began to happen. One of the boys couldn't move after waking up. His body was paralyzed. Another boy, even more shockingly, was hit by a car and died. And this was especially strange, because in the 1960s, especially in rural Hong Kong, cars were extremely rare. So for someone to be hit by a car there, it was beyond unusual. The whole village was shaken. Everyone started asking the 3rd boy, "What exactly did you guys do that night?" But the boy didn't say anything. He kept completely silent. For the time being, he was the only one who seemed fine. No illness, no accidents, nothing. The villagers all assumed it was just a coincidence. But after a while, strange things started happening again. One day, his older sister told him she'd seen a girl following him around. She thought he had a girlfriend, and was even planning to invite the girl over for dinner. But the boy had no idea what she was talking about. He'd never met any girl, never been in a relationship, and definitely didn't know who his sister meant. And it wasn't just his sister. Several villagers also said they had seen him walking around with a girl in a green dress, with long hair tied into braids. People started gossiping, assuming he was secretly dating someone. When the boy heard this, he was shocked. He knew, without a doubt, he wasn't dating anyone. So why was the entire village convinced he had a girlfriend? Then one day, something happened that finally made him open up. He was riding his bike in the village when the brakes suddenly failed. He lost control and fell, nearly crashing into a pond. But the most terrifying part wasn't the accident. It was what he heard after he fell. A woman's voice whispered in his ear.
You think just because you didn't die this time, you're safe. One day, I will find a way to kill you.
That sentence terrified him. He finally told his parents the truth. What the three of them had done that night at the haunted house. When his parents heard it, their faces turned pale. The villagers knew immediately that something was wrong, because that haunted house had always been the most feared place in the village. Everyone had heard stories about it. No one ever dared to go near it. So the villagers quickly asked a spirit medium to come and help. The medium used rituals to try and communicate with the spirit inside the house. But what they found wasn't just one spirit, there were many. They were all women. During World War II, these women had been raped and shot by Japanese soldiers right inside that house. They had died in terrible, painful ways. No one had ever given them a proper burial. Their bodies were simply left there to rot. The spirits said that when the three boys threw firecrackers into the house, it reminded them of what the Japanese soldiers had done to them. Loud, violent, humiliating. It made them furious. The medium suggested performing a ritual to help them move on, a ceremony to release their spirits. But the spirits refused. They didn't want peace. They wanted revenge. They said all three boys must die. No deals, no forgiveness. Of course, the whole village was terrified. Everyone begged the medium to try again, to speak with the spirits, to plead for mercy, to let the boys go. The medium burned a large amount of joss paper at the scene, offering it sincerely to the spirits, asking them to let go of their anger. After a long session of communication, the spirits finally agreed, but only under one condition. The boy who had not yet been harmed, and the boy who had become paralyzed, must take responsibility and chant prayers themselves, day and night, to help the spirits pass on. Only then would they be forgiven. In the end, the two boys chanted sincerely every morning and night. They also followed a strict vegetarian diet for 49 days, to show repentance and help purify their karma. After the ritual was complete, no more strange things happened in the village. The incident was finally considered resolved. As for why the one boy had been spared from harm, people had their own explanation. It turned out that the boy's ancestor had been a Taoist practitioner, a man who had done many good deeds during his lifetime and cultivated spiritual strength. Even after death, his spiritual power continued to protect his descendants. That was the only reason the boy survived. Without that protection, all three of them might not have made it out alive. Even today, there are still many abandoned villages scattered across Hong Kong. Because the city center developed so rapidly, some of these villages, especially those near the border between Hong Kong and mainland China, were left behind. Back during British rule, the government set up restricted zones in those border areas, which made daily life and economic survival very difficult for the villagers. Over time, many of them moved away, and those once living villages slowly turned into forgotten, empty places. It was exactly because these villages were abandoned and uninhabited that they ended up attracting a certain kind of people. And no, I'm not talking about spirits. I'm talking about die-hard war game players. In Hong Kong, where land is scarce and neighbors complain easily. Finding a big enough space to play war games without trouble is nearly impossible. Commercial venues are expensive and cramped, so hardcore players started heading out to the remote areas, to the abandoned villages, where no one lives and no one cares. These villages were perfect. Old crumbling houses, overgrown weeds, wide open land. The whole place felt tailor-made for them. They could set up ambushes, hide, flank, do whatever they wanted, without worrying about bothering residents. Even if they accidentally broke a window or stomped on something, no one would say a thing. One time, a group of war game players arranged a match in one of these deserted villages. Near the border, there were quite a few of them, split into two teams, ready for a full-blown paintball battle. The weather that day was cloudy and cool, just eerie enough to feel exciting. They played for hours, running around, ducking behind cover, getting covered in paint. By the end of the match, people were starting to pack up. Some were tired, ready to go home. That's when it happened. Two players on the field were acting strange. They had clearly been hit multiple times. They should have been covered in paint, but they just kept moving. Like nothing had touched them. They walked right through the field, as if no one else was there. At first, everyone thought they were just cheating, refusing to admit they were hit. So a bunch of players gathered around and fired at them non-stop. Point-blank range, fully automatic, paintballs flying like rain. And then everyone stopped, because no matter how close they were, the paintballs passed right through their bodies. They hit the walls, the wooden beams, even shattered glass windows behind them. But the two figures didn't flinch. No sound, no reaction, no paint, nothing. The entire field went dead silent. In that moment, no one doubted anymore. Those two figures weren't players. In fact, they might not have belonged to this world at all. Some players froze. Some dropped their guns on the spot. No one cared about the match anymore. One by one, they turned and ran. One player said that as he reached the edge of the village and dared to look back, he saw the two figures still standing in the middle of the field, watching them leave, expressionless. Not angry, not smiling, just a blank, cold stare. After that day, no one dared to play war games in that village ever again. Later, of course, someone did a head count. Both teams were complete, not one extra person. And yet, everyone had seen those two figures walking across the field, untouched by paint, completely unbothered. A few days later, one of the players, a guy who liked taking pictures, checked his camera to look back at the photos from that day. In one of the photos, the background wasn't a house or the field. It was an old, broken-down ancestral hall. No one remembered going there. But standing at the entrance of that hall were two dark figures, staring straight into the lens. From that day on, that village was blacklisted in the war game community. People started passing around one sentence: "You weren't the only ones playing out there. You thought it was just a game." But to them, it was an insult. You thought they didn't exist. They were just staying quiet. If you've ever heard a story like this, or if you have had a strange experience in an abandoned place, leave a comment and tell me. You might not be the only one. Remember to like, share, and follow this channel. Every story walks the line between truth and something else. And the next one might just be about you.